Okay. Alright, so we need to discuss solidarity with the oppressed. Alright. Solidarity with the oppressed. The first point that I have in the notes is that the oppressor must have solidarity with the oppressed, and I put through by relinquishing them, the oppressed, of their being for another. Their being for another, right? And this is a concept that comes out of Hegel, and I'm going to discuss this in a second, right? So we need to ask ourselves, what does it mean to talk about being for another? Right? What is the being for another? And I'm going to discuss what being for another is in terms of a Hegelian concept. And Freire uses this idea. He augments it a little bit. And I'm not going to take the time to get into the historical narrative that Hegel situates it in. But with respect to Freire, he uses this idea of being for another in his dialectical discussion between the oppressor and the oppressed group. Here's a citation from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and this will make sense of this idea of being for another. What is being for another? The one is independent, right? Independent, autonomous, right? The one is independent, and its essential nature is to be for itself, right? And that is obviously in relation to a discussion of the oppressor. So that when we're talking about the oppressor, right? The oppressor is independent in general terms. We understand that this gets more complicated in the dialectic, but in a very simple sense, right? And that's why I said you can't use Hegelian being for another explicitly to describe Freire's dialectic between the oppressor and the oppressed group, but you can, it's a good reference, right? And I mean, obviously it is because he cites it himself. So the oppressor, right? The oppressor is independent, and its essential nature is to be for itself, right? So the idea of for itself. For itself. So the idea of for itself is sort of like this, right? Self-referential, right? I'm independent, I'm self-referential, I'm autonomous, my sustenance is maintained by my own faculties, right? My ability to provide for myself, my ability to sustain myself is a consequence of my own faculties, my abilities. Okay, so that's the oppressor. Obviously, this is in contrast to those who are oppressed. Right? This is in contrast to the oppressed group. And the question is, well, what's the relationship with the oppressor? So the one is independent and essential, is independent and its essential nature is to be for itself. The other is dependent and its essence is life or existence for another. So that the oppressed group has a dependency inherently. Again, just a quick caveat. It is not to say that the oppressor isn't dependent on the oppressed group. We recognize from previous videos that the oppressor is contingent, is dependent on the oppressed group, because my act of oppression is mandated by my obligation to oppress. Thus, in identifying myself as an oppressor, I need to have the oppressed group in order to have sort of this identification with myself. So in a sense, there is a dependency between the oppressor and the oppressed, as well as a dependency between the oppressed and the oppressor. But for general terms, in an understanding of this Hegelian idea of being for another, this is how we generally understand it. Later, we obviously know that Freire, he augments this, right? He complicates it a bit more. So the oppressed group is dependent, and the oppressed group, rather than being for itself, right? My dependency is directed outwards, right? My dependency is maintained within. It's sustainable. It's self-referential. For the oppressed group, my dependency is externalized. I need some external force to nurture, to care for, to maintain whatever sustenance is requisite for me to take care of myself, right? So this is not for itself, but this is for, or being, to be technical, right? The being for another, right? This is the being for another. And this idea of being, to be fair, though he doesn't say it, right, but to be fair to Freire, and also to be fair to Hegel, it should be the ontological being, right, the being which has sort of ontological substantiation. What does that mean? We're not just talking about the individual as a person, right? We're not just talking about Jason as being a member of an oppressed class or an oppressed group, and Jason's dependency on the institution or on some external force. It is being as such, the nature in which we talk about any member of any oppressed group is to be dependent on X, right? So when we're talking about being, we mean being in the ontological sense, right? The very essential foundational nature of this group or this individual is to be dependent, right? We mean being in a very strict sense. So we have an idea of the difference between the oppressor as the for itself and the oppressed as the being for another, right? Pretty clear. In talking about solidarity, obviously we're going to have to transform this idea of being for another, right? You can't think about or conceptualize the idea of solidarity, of having unity, of having a confluence of ideas or a confluence of cultural practices if my identity is contingent on some external force, right? Solidarity is precisely antithetical to this idea of externalization, right? There's a solidarity within the group, there's a solidarity within the individual, and that is only attained by self-sufficiency, right? From autonomy. And we recognize that autonomy is a consequence of liberation, so we have a way to go before we get to autonomy and ultimately the for itself. So solidarity with the oppressed is only attained in the concrete recognition of their suffering, never in the abstract notion of their notion of their impoverishment, right? So what does that mean? Solidarity with the oppressed is only attained in the concrete recognition. Okay, when we're saying solidarity with the oppressed, right, and when Freire is talking about solidarity with the oppressed, if we're talking about solidarity with the oppressed, obviously we're talking about the oppressor. The oppressor's solidarity with the oppressed is something like this, right? We're not talking about this, where we'll label this one and we'll label this two, right? We'll label the oppressor as group one and label the oppressed group as group two. We're not talking about this, right? Obviously, this is not an act of solidarity. There's a distinct group, and that group is a group of oppressors. There's a distinct group, and that group is a group of oppressed. And they're if you want to say the set which comprises the group is, there are no redundancies in the set, right? This set is unique, this set is unique. That's not what he's talking about. When we were talking about the solidarity with the oppressed group, we're talking about this. We're talking about getting to 1 and 2, right? So that 1 and 2 are comprised within the same sort of set, right? This, the transition from this to this, is what we're attempting to do, right? We're attempting to see that there is solidarity among oppressors and solidarity among the oppressed. But the attempt to have solidarity between the oppressors and the oppressed, right, between this group and this group, is only possible with a concrete recognition of their suffering. Not this abstracted recognition of suffering like, oh yeah, I know the people in Haiti are suffering after the earthquake, right? Or oh, I know the people overseas are suffering after the tsunami, or I know they feel bad. You know, must be a horrible thing to have to survive that. We intellectualize their suffering. That's not going to happen, right? You cannot attain solidarity, according to Freire. You cannot attain solidarity with an oppressed group as an oppressor in this abstracted sense. It is a very concrete, guttural, visceral recognition of their suffering and their struggle. It is only through a recognition, right? It is only through, and I'm going to have to draw this figure again, it is only through, what is it, 1 and 2? It is only through a recognition. It is only through a recognition of their struggle. And not only a recognition of their struggle, but an appreciation of their struggle, that we can be said to bridge the gap, bridge this gulf between disparate populations, right? To the point where we have one solidarity, between where we have an act of solidarity, an act of solidarity between the oppressed group and the oppressor, right? So it's a convergence, right? It's taking two populations, two separate populations, and through the act of recognition, recognizing that we're not as different as we saw, I recognize your struggle, to where those two populations become one population. So we're going from this state of affairs to this state of affairs. And the way that we transition between state of affairs is through a recognition of the struggle. This is how we attain solidarity with the oppressed group.